Sometimes madness and genius go hand in hand and are oftentimes more connected than we think. The great French author Denis Diderot once said, "Oh, how near are genius and madness! Men imprison them and chain them or raise statues to them." Even famous Northern Renaissance painters like Hieronymus Bosch, who came close to the edge of madness with paintings like The Temptation of St. Anthony, The Garden of Earthly Delights, The Harrowing of Hell, and Haywain, support this idea. With the research of Sigmund Freud leading to the establishment of the field of psychology in the early 20th century, mental illnesses became more well understood, including schizophrenia, which includes a loss of touch with reality, hallucinations, and in some extreme cases, multiple personality disorder. Schizophrenic artists like the painter Edvard Munch and the sculptor Camille Claudel explored new frontiers in art by using their works to express their mental state and as therapy for the schizophrenia that they had. Their works gave others insight into what it was like inside of the mind of someone with schizophrenia, reducing and reforming the stereotypes as stigmas surrounding the disorder. Camille Claudel was a French sculptor who famously struggled with madness, pushing the frontiers of art as she dealt with what was likely schizophrenia. She was born on November 8, 1864, in Villeneuve-sur-Frère, France. She found her love of working with clay at age 12, and her parents were advised to invest in her skills. In 1881, she was enrolled in Colarossi Academy in Paris, a high achievement among art students, especially given the fact that female acceptance rates were lower than those of men. Claudel became the student of the famous French sculptor Auguste Rodin, and eventually became his assistant in 1883. Over time, a love affair relationship developed, and she was then belittled as his mistress, due to him being married already. This affair began to bring out the worst symptoms of her undiagnosed schizophrenia. After the affair ended in 1892, Claudel had to leave Rodin's studio, where she had access to most of the tools she used to create her work. At this point, she was only able to create smaller sculptures. There was a distinct change in the emotions that the works portrayed during this period, often having despair or sadness carved into the faces. However, this was also when she produced some of her best work, which was often inspired by Japanese prints. Some famous works included La Valse, The Mature Age, and Paul Claudel. In 1905, Claudel's mental health plummeted, resulting in her shutting herself in her home and eventually destroying years of her work in a fit of rage. Shortly after this, Claudel's family had her diagnosed with paranoia and schizophrenia, and she was sent to a mental asylum where she spent the rest of her life. According to doctors, she didn't need to be there, but her family's decision was final. After she died, her family never claimed her body, and she was buried in a mass grave belonging to the asylum. The most famous artist who struggled with madness and likely schizophrenia was Vincent van Gogh, a Dutch painter born on March 30, 1853, who truly pushed the frontiers of art in the post-impressionist period. His mother's love of nature and art had been passed down to him, which is evident in his later paintings. By 15, Van Gogh had to quit school and worked for his uncle. At this point, he was fluent in 4 different languages, including Dutch. He struggled with his career, being rejected and thrown out of different schools and places of work. He couldn't hold down a job due to his mental illness, which would often cause him to explode in fits of rage. Each time he went into a mental spiral, his brother would come rescue him and help him get set up in a new location. Eventually, he moved to Brussels, where he began taking art lessons and pursuing a career in painting. His most famous works like Starry Night, The Potato Eaters, 15 Irises in a Vase, and his self-portrait showed how he saw the world through the lens of his mental illness. He pushed the frontiers of art in a movement known as post-impressionism, which wasn't yet popular in France at that time. Later, as Van Gogh was living in Arles, France, his mental health began to rapidly decline, and his brother once again had to come rescue him. At some points, he would drink turpentine and eat paint. It was around this time that the famous post-impressionist artist Paul Gauguin joined him as his roommate, creating works with him. However, within a month they were arguing constantly, and Gauguin walked out. He was followed by Van Gogh, and when he turned around, Van Gogh had a razor in his hand. Later that night, after Gauguin had left, Van Gogh cut part of his left ear off and wrapped it in newspaper. Then, he walked to a brothel and gave it to one of the girls, telling her to take care of it. He was later admitted to the hospital multiple times because of his ear, and then a mental asylum after a petition had been signed to send him there because he was seen as dangerous. The morning of July 27, 1908, he walked down to his house in Arles and shot himself in the chest. He didn't die from the gunshot, but he bled out instead, and the police found him on the floor. Another famous artist who pushed the frontiers of art while struggling with what was likely schizophrenia was Edvard Munch, who was a Norwegian painter born in 1863 to a family of historians and painters. He grew up with many repressed emotions due to his mother's passing and his father's fits of depression and anger, and such emotions were later heavily expressed in his works. Munch went to Paris in 1885, where he was inspired by impressionists such as Claude Monet and Edouard Monet. Throughout all of this, he created some of his most famous works, such as Vampire, Anxiety, and The Scream, which was his most well-known painting. These paintings are somewhat bizarre, possibly due to his schizophrenia and refusal of treatment at times. For example, in two of these paintings, Munch painted a red sky, which seemed to symbolize fear or suffering. He was also inspired by post-impressionists, such as Vincent van Gogh and Paul Cézanne. He later went on to create paintings inspired by nature that featured brighter colors than in some of his earlier works. He used his paintings to describe emotions and sometimes scenes of some of his schizophrenic episodes. Often, though, he created paintings which showed the emotions on the inside of the person in a situation, as opposed to what the eyes could see on the outside. In the case of The Scream, Munch depicted a scene in which he was walking with his friends outside. According to him, the sky shifted blood red, and he felt a scream passing through him and nature. The emotion may have been his way of expressing on a canvas a panic attack, like the one he had suffered in 1892. Edvard Munch died in 1944, and the majority of his paintings were given to the government and put in museums. But his legacy, which put powerful emotions on the border of madness down on canvas, would be felt by the art world for a long time afterward. Perhaps the most concrete example of how schizophrenia can cause an artist to push into new frontiers in art is the story of Brian Charnley, a British painter born on the 20th of September, 1949. He was diagnosed with schizophrenia at around 18 years of age due to multiple breakdowns that hindered his daily life and work at the art school he attended. For the 7 or so years following, he stayed with his family and went in and out of hospitals and was subjected to various treatments. However, it is most instructive to focus on later in his life when he started his self-portrait series. In March of 1991, Brian Charnley decided to slowly wean himself off of his schizophrenia medication in order to fully showcase his mental illness in a series of paintings. He also kept a diary to help explain the paintings. The first painting, done on April 11th to the 16th, 1991, showcases a standard self-portrait of Charnley. Moving through the series, as his doses of medication get smaller and smaller, the paintings begin to lose any resemblance to a human at all. Some common patterns in his paintings were nails on mouths, cigarettes, and red and yellow, which people believe were used to represent the feeling of agony and mental anguish. On his fourth portrait, he used his own blood to, in his own words, try and get over the mental pain I was experiencing. Multiple paintings feature the crossing out of cigarettes due to him believing a force was telling him to quit smoking or else something bad would happen. Moving through his paintings, those recurring similarities continue to appear. Eventually, on the 19th of July, 1991, he painted a completely unrecognizable portrait with red and yellow streaks spread across the canvas. This was his last portrait before he committed suicide, with his paintings still on the easel. These artists use their art to express how schizophrenia presents itself in their daily lives, creating new frontiers in art that have helped eradicate some of the stigmas of the illness in present time, allowing artists such as Yayoi Kusama, who creates wonderful modern art pieces featuring bright colors and polka dots, to live more comfortably in a world that isn't exactly like the world that is in her mind. Art has given artists a new way to express and portray their struggle with mental illnesses like schizophrenia, no matter when they lived. And as they have done so, they have created and explored new frontiers in the world of art. When we look back on the works of artists like Peter Bruegel the Elder, his painting Mad Meg takes on a whole new meaning as we start seeing the world through the eyes of those that society calls insane.